structure. Steps in argument reconstruction. So the third step here, which we all, well, broadly covered in the first week, but now we're going to look at some more details that are involved in that third step. All right, so I'm going to use an example in argument reconstruction. So the first step that you need to be aware of when reconstructing an argument, right? We're using the actual text that we encounter that might contain an argument, and we've recognized that there is an argument contained in the text. So we're about to go about reconstructing that and putting that in the standard form, right? Extracting, recognizing what the conclusion is, what the premises are, but we need to do what we also need to do, or need to be on the lookout for, is to recognize all the stuff that isn't part of the actual argument itself. So all the non-argumentative stuff. So in the book, they give a quite extensive example. And what you should be able to recognize, and what you should get from that passage in the book, and what we're discussing here, is that a lot of the stuff that happens at the beginning of a newspaper article, for example, is stage setting. So basically what people are trying to do often in newspaper articles is just to convince you that something is relevant. And often they don't give you good reasons to conclude that something is relevant. What they just do is rhetorically state that it's relevant in different ways. And that's what's happening here as well. Somebody's saying that such and such a problem, the problem of young people drinking in city centers and generally creating chaos, rears its ugly head. So this is a problem, and the problem is here, right? And I'm saying again in the second sentence that the problem is here. And I'm again claiming that it happens. And then I'm asking a couple of rhetorical questions about it. So a lot of claims are being made that such and such problem is real to convince the reader that the topic of the rest of the text is relevant. It's an important topic to think about. It's important that we think about a solution for the problems described here. But because there is no, but I would argue, and the book argues, that there's no actual argument contained in the beginning of this text. It's just stating that something is a problem without giving reasons why we should conclude that something is a problem. So the first part, I've colored it red. All the first 8 sentences aren't actually relevant in reconstructing the argument. They're just stage setting. They're just rhetorical questions, ways to emphasize to the reader that the stuff we're talking about is relevant. So that's something you should exclude from the reconstruction. And that's an important step, right? In reconstructing an argument, is recognizing all the extraneous stuff, all the stuff that you can leave out. And part of that extraneous stuff is indeed this type of stage setting material. The ninth sentence is already also not part of the argument itself, but it is, as it were, an announcement that the actual argument, the actual point that the author is trying to make is coming, right? This is a problem. I have the solution for you, right? Which is stage setting, and which is also, by the way, a basic structure that you will recognize in your first year writing, but also in your second year writing, right? It's also something you're doing in your thesis. Basically, what you're doing in the introduction of an article is saying, "This is a problem. I have the solution for you," right? In very general terms. Anyway, getting back to this example, what the author is saying in the first 8 sentences is saying that, trying to convince you that it's a problem. Not using reason, but using rhetoric, and indicating that a solution will be forthcoming. And then the actual argument starts. So listed in purple, and in orangey yellow is the actual argument of the text that we need to put into standard form. So, summarizing this first step, we need to identify the argumentative content of the written or spoken text. And we need to leave out the stuff, stage setting, rhetorical question that's not relevant. This is another example I wanted to show you. The first interim exam is fast approaching. What are you doing to make sure you ace the exam? Almost all psychology students who ace the first interim exam of SSR have grinded for their exams. Therefore, it is likely that most students who prepare well will ace their exams. The partial test was quite long and had to be taken in 2 sessions at a computer in a stuffy room. All right, so this is more representative of the type of text examples I might hurl at you during an actual exam. So what you always need to check is what stuff is actually relevant, what stuff is stage setting, what stuff is not relevant to the actual argumentative context. So you should be able to recognize that conclusion, right? So this part says, therefore it is the case that such and such, so that probably indicates a connection between premises and a conclusion. And you should be able to recognize that the stuff around it, so the part in red and not the part in green, is, well, just part of stage setting. I'm just asking a rhetorical question, saying, what are you doing to prepare for your exam? And there's some irrelevant information given about that interim exam, at least irrelevant to the conclusion that's being drawn in the final sentence. So that's the first step. Make sure you're on the lookout for stuff that isn't argumentative, that you can leave out of the reconstruction. One of those things is explanations. So part of the text you might encounter might include an explanation, and that's something you need to leave out. I'm not going to cover that at length, or I'm not going to give you a lot of examples, because we already talked about those in the first week particularly. And there are some general tips that you can use when you're wondering, hey, did I just encounter an explanation, or is the author trying to make an argument? One is whether the stuff that's being said or written is about general knowledge. So is the thing that you're reading about, and you're doubting, is somebody giving an explanation or an argument, is it about general knowledge? Is somebody trying to give a reason why or that the sky is blue, for example? Then we're talking about general knowledge, and if you're in doubt, you could, better decide in such cases, when it's about general knowledge, that somebody's trying to offer an explanation, because everyone knows the sky is blue, so it's more likely that somebody's trying to explain to you why that is the case than to argue that that is the case. All right, so that's one of the things that you could use when in doubt about, is this an explanation or not? Sometimes it's very clear from the text itself. Sometimes it's more ambiguous whether an explanation or an argument is intended, and in that case you can use these 3-4 guidelines for deciding whether it's the one or the other. Often, not always, but more often than not, I would argue, when people are talking about events in the past, they're trying to offer explanations than arguing that something is the case. Again, it's more likely that something in the past is accepted as general knowledge than when we're talking in the past tense or about something in the future. So that's one of the things that you could use when in doubt. Is this an argument or an explanation, to differentiate between the two? Of course, you could try and check what the intention of the speaker is, or the author. So depending on the context of what is written, or so if it's part of a lecture and somebody's trying to explain to you something to you, give a specific explanation, it would be more likely that what's being offered is an explanation instead of an argument. And sometimes we use clear indicator words. In actual text, not that much, but in the examples I will give you, if I will give you an explanation that you should recognize during the actual exam, I will make sure I use clear indicator words. And if those 3 fail, you should also apply the principle of charity. So if you can reconstruct something as either a bad argument or an explanation, then it's more charitable to interpret what somebody's trying to say as an explanation, right? It's more charitable to say, I'm just assuming you're trying to give an explanation, because if I would consider it to be an argument, that would look like a really bad argument, right? So that's a final principle that you could apply in deciding between the one or the other. If I'm asking you to reconstruct an actual argument in the exam, I usually do that using open-ended questions. So if you're in doubt and you think I have good reasons to interpret that this way or that way, you could also write that down in your answer, right? You're saying, I interpreted this as an explanation because such and such and such, right? So what are your considerations? That's the beauty of using open-ended questions. You could tell us what your considerations actually are. All right, so we're talking about extraneous stuff and stuff we need to leave out of the reconstruction. We talked about stage setting, rhetorical questions, and we talked about recognizing explanations. The next step, a little bit of stuff that we need to throw out in some cases, but sometimes we need to rephrase it as something that is more intelligible. So often people use words that are rhetorical or rhetorically charged, that have that are charged word, and we need to diffuse that rhetoric and to get clear meanings for different topics. So if you were to encounter people at a demonstration about, I think it was related to Obamacare, it's been a while ago, and people are claiming that your government can steal from Medicare to support socialized medicine. So the socialized medicine is the new health system that was proposed by Obama. That's why it was called Obamacare. And here the protesters say, no, get your hands off my Medicare. You can't steal from me for my Medicare to pay for Obamacare, because Obamacare is socialized medicine. This is an unclear statement. So one of the phrases that it's unclear here, but is rhetorically charged, is socialized medicine. What is it exactly? That's a very vague term, but the implication that people are trying to trade on is that this is bad, right? If it's socialized, it's communist, it's bad. But if you try to come up with different specific interpretations of that term, you might say, well, socialized medicine could be that it's a form of healthcare insurance that is at least in part covered by the government. And if you then check what Medicare actually is, then you were to Google that, what is Medicare, then on the side of Medicare it says Medicare is a federal health insurance program for different types of people. So what they're basically saying is, don't steal from my government-funded health insurance to support a government-funded health insurance, which is a weird thing to say, right? So if we diffuse the rhetoric in what's being said here, the meaning, potential interpretations become more clear, and that yields, well, a weird thing to wave around even during a demonstration. Another thing that's weird, to say that the government should keep its hands off the Medicare, because, well, again, Medicare is a federal health insurance program. So it kind of makes sense that the federal government has its hands on that program, right? What we're doing here is taking unclear phrases and trying to take out the rhetoric, the rhetorical force of those phrases. So we're trying to diffuse the rhetoric by making more specific interpretations. Sometimes when you're encountering vague or ambiguous terms, we'll return to that in a bit, it's not always possible to come up with a clear interpretation, and then you'll just have to conclude that I don't know what the person is trying to argue here, so I can't actually make that part of the reconstruction. All right, let me give you another example of diffusing rhetoric. This is a documentary I watched last week, which is Super Size Me Part 2. Perhaps you have seen it, but it's about a guy starting his own fast food restaurant selling grilled chicken sandwiches, like other fast food chains are doing. And he's trying to be completely clear and honest towards his customers of what different terms mean when they're being used in the fast food industry. So the chickens he sells on a sandwich are called free range, cage free, no hormones added, humanely raised, and 100% natural, which are all terms that trade on their rhetorical force. He calls it, together with the advertising agency he used to construct these terms and his messaging, as halo terms, right? They create, as they mentioned, a health halo. So you have a halo, it draws up different associations, right? So the chicken gets a healthy halo, and people feel more healthy about themselves after eating chickens that are labeled as such. But the actual terms have no relevant meaning in this context, and that's why he could use them. He could use these terms and still get the seal of approval from the relevant agencies in the government, because free range is defined as chickens, in this case, that have the possibility to go outside for 51% of their life. So what he did, he constructed a small cage in the opening of one of the doors, which enabled the chickens to walk outside for half a meter or so before encountering the border of the cage, which fits this description. They have the possibility to go outside. No chickens do, but they could if they want to. So that's free-range chicken. It's cage-free, which is misleading because no chickens are raised in cages in the United States. They're all raised in barns. So you could put it on the label, but it doesn't have any meaningful interpretation when you're trying to decide what to eat. No hormones added, to which the same applies. It's required by US law, sorry for the typo, to put no hormones in chickens. So the fact that you doesn't, well, differentiate between this chicken and any other chicken. Humanely raised, that's a term that you can define as a producer of chicken. And 100% natural means that it's minimally processed. And 100% natural only applies to what happens to the chicken after it's dead, right? So how it's been processed in the factory, that you could call natural or not. So basically, if you see the actual meanings of the terms and you were to diffuse the rhetoric of the terms as used in the advertisement, you would get these types of interpretations. That's exactly what we mean with diffusing the rhetoric. We take out all the associative stuff, right? The health halos it generates. So the fact that if you read that something is 100% natural, you think it's more healthy, or it grew up in the wild, or whatever your associations were. We take all that out and we look for the literal meaning of the term, in this case, which is much more limited than you would have imagined. Again, it's an example, a real-life example of how you could use these steps when trying to diffuse the rhetoric in what somebody is saying to you in a movie or through advertisement or packaging. All right, so what we've done so far is that we threw out a bunch of stage-setting rhetorical questions, and we looked at explanations, and we looked at unclear language use. In this case, people trying to trade on the rhetorical force of the words being used. And we can try to diffuse that rhetoric by making the meanings, or trying to make the meanings more clear in our reconstruction of the argument. You could also just, which is related to the stuff we just talked about in terms of rhetorical force, is encounter unclear terms, right? So in the example we just used, let's go back to the original example. So this is something that you might encounter on an actual exam. So you have a couple of sentences, and you should be able to recognize that the first two sentences and the final sentence are just stage setting and not relevant to the actual argument. And if we then focus in on the green part of the argument, there's still something that we need to make clear before we can put this in standard form, which are terms that might be considered unclear. So what does it mean when somebody aces an exam? And what does it mean when somebody has grade grinded for their exam? This, by the way, is not a term that I've heard actual students use, by the way. It's something you can look it up online. It's a term that you could use when you're trying to say that you're studying really, really hard. But it's not a common way of talking about studying hard for an exam. That's something that you need to translate in your propositions. You need to make sure that the actual meaning of the words that is intended becomes clear in the propositions that you're putting in that reconstruction. So in the terms of acing, that students that scored really high, or students that got a high grade on their exam, would be more clear than saying that somebody aced an exam. People that were well prepared or very well prepared, or students that were studying really, really hard to prepare for an exam, would be more clear to say than students who grade grinded. One of the reasons why you need to make those phrases clear is that you can make the connections between the propositions, and we'll return to that in a bit, more clear as well. So if the conclusion says something about preparing well, it's more useful for your final assessment of the argument that the other propositions used the same terms were relevant, right? So it's more likely that the author, instead of grade grinding, meant something along the lines of preparing well here, because that's part of the conclusion. And the ace part we need to make clear in both the premises as well as the conclusions. All right, so we need to make stuff that is vague or unclear or rhetorically charged clearer. And that applies to both individual words as well as specific phrases, which is something we'll look at now. So if you would encounter something, this is something somebody in government, the Bush administration said about in the events leading up to the war in Iraq. And he's predicting that after we've landed there and had our invasion, then we will show that it's actually worse than we thought. And we will conclude that it was a country that had the capability in weapons of mass destruction areas in which terrorists like ants to honey were going after it. So this contains all the stuff we've been talking about, rhetorically charged language, but I want to specifically focus on that phrase in red. So what is a weapon of mass destruction? That's, well, actually a bit ambiguous, because you can look it up and there's an actual definition, a legal definition of what a weapon of mass destruction is. It is either a destructive device such as an explosive or incendiary bomb, rocket, or grenade, a weapon that is designed to cause death or serious through toxic or poisonous chemicals, is something that's designed to do the same only through biological agents or toxins, or through high levels of radiation or radioactivity. So basically it's chemical weapons or nukes or biological weapons or a destructive device. So that is what makes the phrase ambiguous, right? So it could be either one of those four things, but it's also vague, because if you focus in on that first definition of a destructive device, then that's very vague. That can be a machine gun, but it can also be a stone, right? If I throw a stone at somebody's head, I'm throwing a destructive device. So does it mean that it's a weapon of mass destruction? So no. So the extension of the term destructive device is unclear, which makes it a very vague term. So we've seen examples. I tried to remind you of what the meaning of ambiguous and vague was, right? Ambiguous means that one term has multiple extensions and it's not clear which one is meant. And vagueness means that a term has an extension which is doesn't have a clear demarcation. So it's unclear what falls under the extension of the term and what doesn't. So weapons of mass destruction is an example. Tall is another example, which is used a lot in actual language, right? So it's very difficult to come up with a very precise definition of what we mean by saying a person is tall, right? Where does that start? Is it with so much centimeters, a little bit more, a little bit less? That's very difficult to define exactly. So that's another category that has a vague extension. All right, I'm going to apply that to an example. And by discussing this example, it should be clear to you how you can deal with vagueness and ambiguity. The takeaway, basically summarized, is this. So for vague terms, you need to think, given the context, where you can come up with a more specific interpretation, given all the information available to you, and given a context. And if that's impossible, vague terms need to be left out of the reconstruction. You should just conclude, this is too vague. I don't think the author, him or herself, had an actual specific interpretation in mind. At least I can decipher it from the context, so I need to leave it out of the actual argument. The other thing is dealing with ambiguity. So ambiguity you could deal with so in the case of ambiguity, you have a couple of potential interpretations that apply to the phrase that you're trying to decipher. And what you can do is you can try them out. So you can reconstruct it with using one interpretation, you can reconstruct it with another interpretation, and you can reconstruct it with another interpretation, and assess all three reconstructed versions of the argument and see whether it matters, whether you choose the one or the other interpretation in assessing the argument, and weigh that into your final assessment. So that's what we're going to do with this example. So if somebody said to you, homosexuality is unnatural, therefore it must be immoral, perhaps that's something you recognize. That's not an uncommon argument to be made by people who would think along these lines. That's something we can reconstruct in standard form, but then we would run into the difficulty of trying to figure out what somebody means with the terms unnatural and the term immoral, right? So we can try out different interpretations and see what that does for our assessment of the argument. So we can make it explicit. So we say homosexuality is unnatural. That's become the first premise, and the conclusion stuff behind therefore is listed here behind the line. And I've added a implicit premise, which I made explicit. That's a connecting premise, right? It basically it makes a connection between the conclusion and the premises that I think was implied when somebody was making this argument. Homosexuality is unnatural, everything unnatural is immoral, so homosexuality is immoral, right? So the connection between the morality and homosexuality is created by the second premise, which was implied by the original argument. So I made it explicit, and I made it explicit because then I can try it out. Right, so that's basically up to you. That's your interpretation. If you say, well, that second premise, which I made explicit, I don't think that was actually intended, you would leave it out out of your reconstruction. And then you would just say this argument is not valid and it's not forceful, and you're done. If you think this is usually what people imply, but they do not make it explicit in their original argument, then you should make that premise explicit to provide that connection between the first premise and the conclusion. And then you would say, well, in this form, the argument is valid, but we still need to check whether, it makes sense, right? So whether the premises are actually true. And for that, we need a more specific interpretation of the terms unnatural and immoral. So we could use different interpretations, and we could look at what that means for assessment of that argument. So here's my first interpretation. So if somebody says this, you could reconstruct this as following. So I'm trying to decipher the term unnatural, right? That's unclear to me, so I could try out different interpretations, indicated here in red as well. So it could be that people, when they say unnatural, that means that's something that violates the laws of nature. Everything that violates the law of nature is immoral, therefore homosexuality is immoral, right? It's the same argument, but I give a more specific interpretation to what unnatural means. And then you can assess that, right? And I'm not going to the full assessment, but I've just given you a counterexample to show you how silly the reconstruction of the argument would be using this interpretation of unnatural. So you could also go say the same about walking on water, right? That violates the laws of nature. Everything that violates the laws of nature is immoral, therefore walking on water is immoral. It's the same structure, and actually the circles in which you might encounter this argument would be less inclined to agree with the second argument. So that's an interesting counterexample to offer people. All right. So I've interpreted unnatural as something that violates the laws of nature. But perhaps that was not the meaning that was intended. Perhaps there's another interpretation that you could think of for the term unnatural, which is something that is statistically uncommon. Okay, so, right, then we'll try that out. We'll put that in the reconstruction and see what happens. Homosexuality is statistically uncommon. Everything that's statistically uncommon is immoral. Homosexuality is immoral. Again, we could offer a counter-argument, a reconstructed argument that has the same structure as the original argument that shows you, in this case, why it doesn't hold, right? You could say that celibacy is statistically uncommon. Everything that's statistically uncommon is immoral, so celibacy is immoral. Again, the people who would be more inclined to agree with the first argument would be at a loss to agree with the second argument. All right. There's a couple of questions in the chat about, is it vague or ambiguous? In this case, you could deal with it the same way, right? So you're considering, well, what could the potential intended meanings, what are the potential intended meanings of the argument unnatural, of the term unnatural in this case? So I'm trying out a couple that I think are more or less common, and let's see whether the argument is more or less convincing with any of those interpretations. And as we're going to see, that doesn't hold. Homosexuality is unnatural, therefore it must be immoral. You could interpret the term unnatural as saying something is artificial. Another potential interpretation that people mean that would make it somewhat more specific, the meaning. But then again, if we apply a different counterexample, painkillers are artificial, should we therefore conclude that painkillers are immoral? It doesn't work, right? Whatever our interpretation is of the term unnatural. And we could even make this more specific, right? We could say that unnatural, something that's unnatural means that, in this case, means specifically that you're using your sex organs for purposes other than reproduction, which is counter to evolutionary purposes, and everything that is counter to evolutionary purposes is immoral, right? So I've included an additional assumption. You're doing something that goes counter to evolutionary purpose, and if you're doing something that goes counter to evolutionary purpose, you're being immoral. Again, you could add a different example of a different counterexample showing that the argument still is ridiculous or shouldn't be considered sound if you use a different counterexample. So contraception would entail using your sex organs for purposes other than reproduction, which doesn't mean that we would consider contraception to be immoral. And you could use that final interpretation of the argument. You could also use a different type of counter argument, right? So you could replace the term homosexuality for something else and leave the rest as it is, or doing something similar with the rest. So you could say that wearing earrings entails using ears for purposes other than hearing, and then the rest of the argument is the same as above. Using ears for purposes other than hearing is counter to evolutionary purposes. So therefore, wearing earrings, should be the conclusion, is considered immoral. I'm showing you different examples. Also, I actually like talking about this example. It's an argument that you for sure might encounter in the real world. The people think along these lines. And what I'm trying to show you is that usually people argue using somewhat vague and or ambiguous terms. And one way to deal with that is to try and pin down what people are saying. So, okay, you're saying unnatural. Is this what you mean? Is that what you mean? Is this what you mean? It has to be one of these, right? Because otherwise it wouldn't become more clear. So if you've gone through 3 interpretations and it's still, and you've shown that it doesn't matter which interpretation you choose, it's still an unsound argument. Then you're basically done, right? So you know for yourself that the argument is unsound. And whenever people are saying this type of stuff about naturalness of such and such behavior, that you shouldn't be convinced by it, right? So that helps in actual life, but it's also an example of how you can deal with ambiguity and fakeness. And more often than not, in actual language use, especially in the case of vagueness, your final conclusion will probably be, I don't know what the author intended here. The term is just too vague to come up with any more specific interpretation of the term, so I'll just have to leave it out. All right.
Next question in the group.
I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Theresa.
There's a question in the group about if we have to discriminate between ambiguity and vagueness, or if we can practically treat them as the same.
If I ask you to differentiate between ambiguity and vagueness, it will be very clear which one is which. In actual use of how you might actually encounter vagueness and ambiguity in the field, as it were, it's often not that very useful to just say it's only vague and it's only ambiguous. More often than not, it's both. The practical upshot of the fact that you can recognize something as ambiguous is that you at least have some specific interpretations of the term or phrase that are being used, and that makes it more worthwhile to try out different of those interpretations in different reconstructions of the argument. If something is really vague, and even in the context is vague, then you're more likely to end up with saying that I don't know what's intended here, so I'll just leave it out. So I need you to know what the difference is between vagueness and ambiguity, and I might test that knowledge by giving a very clear-cut example, a multiple choice question. Is it either this or that? In the field, in actual examples that you need to reconstruct, basically what you're doing is the same, except for the fact that when deciphering ambiguous phrases, it's more likely that you're able to salvage at least a couple of specific interpretations, while in vague phrases, that's less likely to be the case.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Was there another? Bram was were you going to say the same or?
Yeah, I was about to say the same, but now there's another question in the chat which says, so it's vague when you can't come up with definitions, but that's basically what you just said, right?
Yeah, or you can come up with a precise definition, right? So you can't come up with a definition that's more precise than the term that it describes. Yeah. So vagueness, again, words have. Words have an extension, right? The thing that or the range of things that a word refers to in the actual world, that's the extension of the term. And if what falls within that extension or outside of that extension is unclear, then you call that term vague. If you have multiple clear extensions, but you don't know which one is intended, you would call it ambiguous. But again, as has been pointed out in the chat, sometimes, or a lot of the times, it's difficult to say this is just vagueness and it's not ambiguous. A lot of the times it's both, as in the example of weapons of mass destruction that I just pointed out. And for how you reconstruct the argument, the practical difference is only in that if it's ambiguous, that means that you have different specific interpretations that you can try out in your reconstruction. And if it's vague, it's more likely that you just throw up your hands and say, I don't know what's meant here, so I'll just leave it out. All right. So what we did so far is some logical streamlining, and you already saw an example of how you should make implicit premises explicit. And I'll try to stress what we mean by logical streamlining. It's something I did in the Babelfish example as well. So what we need to do is we need to rephrase what's being said in the text or in spoken word as something that uses clear logical operators. It's not you don't need to do this, but it's more useful when you're going to assess an argument if you were able to reconstruct it as if-then statements or statements or and statements. So those are the logical operators that you've learned to recognize. So it's easier to reason with them if you are able to reconstruct your argument containing these if-then statements. So containing conditional statements or disjunctive statements. This is true or that is true. So this is part of the... No, this is a different example. This is also drawn from the book. So if you think I'm going quickly, then you can still look it up in the chapter 5. So somebody is claiming something in an opinion piece. So what would the elimination of the marriage tax credit mean? Less incentive to marry. And what would that mean? Fewer couples getting married. And what would that mean? A reduction in the proportion of children living in families. So if you were to extract the argument from that, if you were come to the conclusion in the rest of the text that this is part of an argument, how would you reconstruct that? Well, use the conditional statements, right? What they're saying here is that if P occurs, then Q occurs. And if Q occurs, then Y occurs. And if Y occurs, then Z occurs, right? So I'll try to put it into symbols. But in your reconstruction, whether you put it as symbols or as written text, use those if-then statements because it makes it easier for you to do that logical assessment after that. Right? Because in this case, you would recognize this as being a chain argument and it would make it easier. The conclusion isn't indicated here, but it would make it easier for you in the next step to do the logical assessment. All right. And this is part of what we call, or what the book calls, logical streamlining, right? So you're rephrasing the propositions in a way that make it more clear what the intended logical connections are. So this is, again, the example from the actual exam example that I used, right? About the grade grinding and stuff like that. So we need to... It's already kind of clear in this example, right? So it's already kind of clear that that we're generalizing... we're talking about almost all psychology students, so that quantifier is already clear. So we can put that in the premise of almost all psychology students who passed the first interim exam of SSR have prepared well for the exam. You could leave that as it is. You could also rewrite it if that works better for you. You could also say that if somebody passes... if somebody does well on the first interim exam, they've probably prepared well for that exam. So you could also translate that generalization to if-then statement. You don't have to, but if it works better for you, you could. As long as you reconstruct it as either with clear quantifiers or with conditional or disjunctive statements where necessary. So we translate that, we put it in the standard form. And we learn to recognize that, therefore, it is likely that as an indication that, well, somebody is trying to make an inductive argument, that something is the case, and the stuff followed by, therefore, it's likely that is probably the conclusion that somebody is trying to offer. So we recognize the premise, we recognize the conclusion, and we put that in standard form. And we try to make the implied logical relationships explicit in how we rephrase the sentences in the standard form. So the final step is, in that logical streamlining, is to make implicit and connecting premises explicit. I already did that with the example we talked about, right? I already said it's up to your interpretation. Do you think that this implicit premise is intended or not? And do you need to make it explicit in your reconstruction? Often that means the difference between reconstructing something as an argument that isn't valid and isn't forceful. So if you just literally put the propositions that you deem relevant in the standard form, you get something like this, of which you could say, well, it isn't forceful, it isn't valid, it isn't forceful, and I'm done. But you could argue that what people usually mean when they say stuff like this, what they imply but leave out in their explicit words, is the following. So almost all psychology students who pass the first interim exam of SSR have prepared well for their exam. If almost all X did Y first, then all who do Y will probably become X. This is related to one of the fallacies we're going to talk about on Tuesday, which is related to one of the substantive fallacies, which means that it includes a very common assumption that is very general. So you can assume that a lot of the times this is what people intend, even though that they don't make it explicit, but it is a step in their reasoning. So you would be justified to make it explicit in your reconstruction. And the beauty of that is that you can then try a counterexample. Again, right? Can anybody think of a counterexample to this argument? And then indeed, Britt, it's time for a break.
Someone who prepared well but didn't pass their exam?
Right. That would, strictly speaking, if you would put that in the standard form, then you would have a countermarket. So to be sure, a counterargument, and we're going to talk about it after the break in more detail, is giving an argument that has the same structure as the original argument, but by using different terms, as I did with the homosexuality and unnaturalness example. By changing those terms, you can see that the premises, that the argument, depending on your reconstruction, is either not valid or unsound. In this case, you could say that, well, almost all psychology students who passed the first interim exam of SSR have slept well before their exams, or something like that. Or they've brushed their teeth, or they drank milk, or they took a shower, right? That doesn't mean that all students who take a shower will pass their exams. That's using a counterexample. So that's exchanging the terms, but keeping the structure of the argument the same. And by using different terms, it becomes more intuitive to see that, no, this doesn't hold. So that second premise is not true, at least not how it's phrased here. All right. So summarizing what we did, we looked at reconstructions of arguments. We did that with a silly example, which has actual practical implications if you're trying to argue about p-values or trying to debate people who believe in intelligent design. And we've looked at in more detail at the steps I took there. So we looked at what logical streamlining is, how we should deal with rhetorically charged words, vague words, ambiguous phrases, and we looked at how to remove extraneous material. After the break, we're going to talk about 3 principles that you need to bear in mind when making a reconstruction of an argument. And finally, we're going to talk about some useful things you should consider when assessing arguments, including the argument about intelligent design that we started off with.